When I left the hospital just up the road, and it's been interesting this last decade or so, that come out to the same Ontario exit, but rather than turning left, I turned right. But when I left the hospital this last Friday evening, there was a large grieving family who was in one of the ICU rooms waiting for the patient there to take his final breath. He was a husband, father, grandfather, brother, in-law, friend. And the number of people I exclaimed to them when I came into the room that I didn't realize that one of those ICU rooms could take as many people as were in that space at that moment. The reality is, of course, that death happens. It happens to all of us, both in terms of others that we love dying and, of course, ourselves dying at some stage. Death happens. Some 2,000 people each year succumb in our Mississauga hospitals. And the circumstances of this man's dying were far from unique. He showed improvement initially before suffering a relentless progression of lung weakness, which eventually confined him to bed without strength enough to stand. And after a month of no improvement, no sign that his health would ever turn around, he asked to be removed from his life supports. It's a kind of body integrity. What happens when our bodies no longer allow us to function as we'd previously pictured ourselves to be? What happens when we're no longer physically who we once were? For him, still a reasonably fit until this man of 85, he was now confined to bed and tethered to a ventilator 24 hours a day. And he decided that he was no longer the person he had been or that he wanted to be. And since he was competent to make a decision, he chose to be disconnected from that machine which continued to give him breath. He could no longer adjust the person he had become, body, mind, and spirit, to the individual he had known himself to be for all those years. The story that Kathleen told and the words that Jean read describe, though, a different kind of disintegration, a different kind of suffering. And it's a growing reality. And John, I thank you for your remembrance of your mother. The Alzheimer's Society of Canada estimates that more than 500,000 individuals in this country live with dementia, most common category of neurodegenerative disorders. Nowadays, 1 in 100 of us living in home settings has that diagnosis, as do almost half of all of the long-term care residents. Both the Canadian Study of Health and Aging and Statistics Canada report an increasing prevalence in dementia with each decade of longevity, so that as we grow to live longer, the number of people living with dementia also grows. The Alzheimer's Society expects this number to rise to just under 1 million a decade from now, an increase of almost 2/3. Some of you accompanied me in my early ministry here with you as I grieved, both in anticipation and then eventually in the reality of death, the gradual loss of my mother's memory to Alzheimer's, to witness that relentless annihilation of a personality is excruciating. To watch the gradual erosion of memory is to painfully witness the unraveling of a life. And that's viewing it from the outside, even with caring and compassion. I shudder to imagine how a person losing their memory experiences it. My partner Kate and I had for some time known that we were traveling this path. Even at our wedding some years before, my mother had persistently inquired of me as we stood there greeting guests, "What's happening?" As the years progressed, I watched as more and more of her slipped from her grasp. Friends of decades became unrecognized, as did we all eventually. She dove into fits of rage, a stark contrast with her formerly mild-mannered demeanor. These were followed by mellow moods of oblivion, also totally unlike her. And in her final year in a nursing home, she simply slouched in the bed, unresponsive to anything, any movement around her. Her body persisted, her mind and her spirit ceased. I would suggest that while in each of these instances we are not the same person, there exists a profound difference between the two, and it all revolves around memory. In the course of a health law class that I took this fall, I had the chance to consider the question, what makes us who we are? What makes us us? What contributing features create us as human beings as we know it? In the context of healthcare decision-making, everything hinges on a person's competence. The dual ability, one, to understand what we're being offered in terms of a procedure or whatever healthcare, and two, to be able to weigh the consequences of the decision that we make. What happens, though, when we lose that capacity? Often that's where advanced directives, things we call living wills or something like that, play a significant role. It's one way we can enter into that broader question of what does make us human. I'd also add parenthetically for all of us that advanced directives do not necessarily take the form of a written document. They could be audio, they could be video, or they could take some other form. I would still, having now been in the hospital for about a decade, suggest that it also takes some kind of written form, because that's the one that most reliably gets through to the healthcare staff there, at least for the time being. In the presentation I did for my law class, I argued that in law, as well as in reality, the individual in the present is the same person who created the advanced directive in the past. That might seem obvious to you, or maybe it doesn't. But our legal definition of personhood, at least partially, is embedded in the now. Because you agreed to a blood transfusion yesterday doesn't mean that the physician can presume that you will accept one today. Psychologists and philosophers generally posit two starkly different understandings of personhood. One approach, taken by people like Rebecca Dressa, questions whether a decisionally capable person and an incapable self are the same person. They argue that individuals have what they would call current autonomy. That is, that the two people in the same body at different times are independent of each other. They declare that that pleasantly befuddled person in front of you now is not the same competent individual you met earlier. In contrast, people like Ronald Dworkin, this is not Richard Dworkin, build their case on precedent autonomy, as they would call it. They argue that we are composed of our experiences and interests, our values and concepts, our personal identity and narrative. In other words, we are our past and our present and even our future in a unified self. The philosopher Eric Olson pushes that farther, naming persistence as a fundamental component of our personal identity. Many 20th century philosophers have endorsed some version of identity as psychological continuity. We are more than our memory. We are more than our bodies. We are more than the sensory inputs that our senses give to us. In the present, we are those future beings who in some sense inherit our mental features from our earlier selves, beliefs, memories, preferences, a capacity for rational thought, emotions. We are those past beings whose mental features we have inherited in the present. Personal identity, the self, is an amalgam of all. Most research in these two disciplines, as well as in ethics and in religion, suggests that personal identity consists of more than momentary apprehensions of sense experience or memory that are time-bound, our present selves are connected with. Personal identity consists in recognizing the features of ourselves and an awareness of our inner state of existence, of existing. Alfred Lord Tennyson had it right, I think, when he penned, "I am a part of all I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams the untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move." To all of this, I would add that there's still another component of what makes us the human being that we are. We are, in fact, a reflection in other people. In our being, how the people who surround us and care for us know us helps us to shape and to understand who we are. They influence our understanding of ourselves, and furthermore, I would suggest that our beingness is something that lives in them too. It's truly a relational, a two-way street that occurs. We are continually in relationship, and it forms how we see ourselves and how we are seen. And I have to say that this is more than an aspect of connection that's just nice. I say it's an essential element, because in it we reverence the dignity and worth of all people. It demands that everyone, no matter who she or he is is of equal status, whatever their capabilities, whatever their deficits, whatever their vulnerabilities. Listen to the pleading words of Owen Darnell. This, in some sense, from the inside of someone with dementia. Do not ask me to remember. Don't try to make me understand. Let me rest and know you're with me. Kiss my cheek and hold my hand. I'm confused beyond your concept. I'm sad and sick and lost. All I know is that I need you to be with me at all costs. I would say that all of these considerations bound together manifest in your integrity, in my integrity, in anyone's integrity. These considerations tie directly to my current interests. Many of you probably realize that Parliament is about to reopen the debate over MAID, medical assistance in dying. The current legislation mandates a review take place within a 5-year period of its enactment, and the MPs have already received 3 lengthy reports that they had asked for from the Council of Canadian Academies on the current state of knowledge on 3 particular areas of concern that weren't in the legislation that we're currently under. They are concerned with mature minors, with people with mental disorders that are the sole underlying cause for the request, and the question of advance requests. You're more than welcome to read the 700 plus pages of this if you're so inclined. They appear on the council website. One of the things that's happened, though, is that the recent Truchon-Gladeau decision in Quebec dictated that made requirement that death must be reasonably foreseeable. The court suggested that that was unconstitutional, and that's accelerated the timetable somewhat. And so, and I will share this with you, maybe you know it, the Justice Ministry is currently seeking public input on how to amend the MAID legislation. It has posted online a questionnaire seeking responses from all of us. And I would also mention that the deadline for this is a week Monday, January 27th. It closes down at 11:59 p.m. It's only since the early years of the 21st century that advanced directives, those things that we do use now in hospital often, were accepted as a mechanism for guiding medical decisions. This idea of living wills is a relatively new phenomenon. I would ask us, though, given what we do know, why shouldn't the same right be granted for someone choosing MAID, given an understanding of personhood as continuing even in dementia? Often individuals who have asked for MAID through an advance directive have outlined very specific conditions under which they would want it provided. It might be that they have ceased to have any meaningful interactions with their surroundings, where intelligence, self-awareness, or consciousness has disappeared. They've described situations where they no longer recognize family or friends, or when they can no longer feed or toilet themselves. This is not an unusual circumstance these days. And most of us, I think, have probably run into situations where this has occurred. The Council of Canadian Academies found that there is general support for the legal mechanisms through which a person can provide advance consent from aid. They turned to polls, and they mentioned that in most instances, more than 2/3 of us, of Canadian public, have suggested that they support advance requests for MAID in the event of advanced dementia and a clear written request. Some up to 80% advocating for that. It's a lot to consider. And now is the moment. So may it be. Here we have brought our joys and sorrows. We have brought our pains, our surprises, our happy moments, the full measure of our lives. We found friendship, renewal, and a time to ponder life's meaning. Now we depart, reinvigorated by the touch of mystery that surrounds us always, ready to live our days as a gift that we have received unmerited and that we give unbidden.